The wind that carried Jonas Hale into Dry Creek was a tired, untrustworthy thing, half dust, half memory. It tugged at his coat, lifted the brim of his hat, and whispered through the bones of the dying cottonwoods that lined the single dirt road leading into town. It smelled of rain that would never fall, and of something older, something that had waited too long to be forgotten. He rode a dun horse, lean and scarred, like its rider. The beast's ribs showed faintly beneath the hide, but it moved steady, each hoof landing with a soft, deliberate sound. Jonas's rifle was slung across his saddle, his bedroll tied behind him, his worldly goods packed into a single worn canvas sack. He was a man accustomed to silence, and Dry Creek seemed willing to offer plenty of it. The town stirred as he passed, the way a grave stirs when someone walks too close. A few faces appeared in doorways. Women holding children squinted into the sunlight. Men with tobacco-stained fingers leaned on porch posts. The blacksmith's hammer paused mid-swing. Dust rose around Jonas's boots and hung there, unwilling to settle. He stopped outside the general store, tied his horse to the post, and stepped onto the warped wooden planks of the porch. The bell above the door rang softly as he entered. Inside, the air was close and smelled faintly of flour and kerosene. Behind the counter stood a woman in a faded blue dress, her shawl drawn around her shoulders despite the warmth, Mara McCary. He knew her face before she spoke. It was Lila's face in quieter tones, less shine, more shadow. Lines of solitude had shaped her mouth, and her eyes, though kind, had learned not to expect much. "Can I help you, sir?" she asked. Her voice was steady, but her hands hesitated over the scales. Jonas removed his hat and nodded. "Coffee," he said. "Flour, salt." "Nails, if you've got 'em." She turned to gather the items, and he caught a glimpse of her braid, thick, dark, streaked with a single thread of gray. It reminded him of the riverbanks near Fort Wallace, where willows bent low under wind and snow. "You're buying for yourself?" she asked, setting down the sack of flour. "For now," he said. "Bought the old Carver place out by the ridge." Her hand stopped mid-motion. A small silence grew between them, deep and hollow. "That land belonged to my family once," she said softly. "Before Lila married and I stayed." Jonas nodded. "I heard." He did not tell her he had stood beside her brother-in-law the day he died, that he had watched the firelight flicker over his face as he whispered Lila's name for the last time. That was a story too heavy for daylight. The door opened behind him, letting in a gust of wind and a curious boy who peered at Jonas's rifle. The moment broke. Mara wrapped the purchases, her movements neat and precise. When she handed the bundle across the counter, their fingers brushed, just for an instant, and he saw a spark of recognition in her eyes. "You rode with Samuel McCary, didn't you?" He hesitated, then nodded once. She looked down, the words pulling something deep inside her chest. "Then you know how it ended." "I do," Jonas said quietly. Outside, a wagon rattled by, and the sound filled the space between them. Mara tied the bundle with string and slid it toward him. "Dry Creek's a small place," she said. "Folk talk. You'll hear things." "I've heard worse." A faint smile touched her mouth, so small it might have been mistaken for a shadow. "Maybe so." He tipped his hat, gathered his supplies, and left without another word. The bell above the door rang again, softer this time, almost like regret. The ranch waited for him in silence. The land was scarred by drought and neglect. The fences leaned like tired old men, and the barn listed to one side, its roof half collapsed. A plow rusted near the corral, its handles gray with age. But there was something honest about the place, something worth the ache in his shoulders. Jonas led his horse into the yard, untacked it, and let it drink from the trough. Then he stood on the porch of the sagging house, staring at the mountains in the distance. Their peaks caught the last of the sun, burning gold against the darkening sky. Inside, the air was stale. A single chair, a cold stove, a Bible missing its cover. He dropped his bedroll in the corner and began sweeping dust from the floor. Each stroke stirred ghosts, the laughter of a woman he'd never met, the sound of boots across this same wood years ago, the creak of a rocking chair left to rot on the porch. By the time the sun slipped behind the ridge, Jonas had built a small fire. He boiled coffee in a blackened pot and sat on the porch with the cup in his hands. The steam rose like smoke, and the first stars came out, fragile, uncertain. From this high ground, he could see the lights of Dry Creek scattered below. Among them, one small lamp burned longer than the rest, steady, patient. Mara's window, he guessed. He thought of her face behind the counter, her hands working the scales, her voice soft but unbent. Not beautiful in the way Lila had been described, no gold curls, no laughter that made men dream of sin, but there was something in Mara's stillness that unsettled him. A strength born of long years without applause. He sipped his coffee and listened to the prairie breathe. Somewhere far off, a coyote called. The sound echoed against the empty hills. Jonas looked at the ring he still wore on a leather cord around his neck. His wife's ring. She died 5 winters ago when fever swept through the soldiers' camp. He had buried her himself in frozen ground, her hair still damp from the river water he used to cool her brow. Since then, no word had ever seemed worth saying. He rubbed the ring between his fingers, then let it drop back against his chest. The fire crackled, the stars turned slow, and the wind rose again, whispering through the cracks in the walls. Below, that single lamp in Mara McCary's window flickered, then steadied, like someone who had learned to live without expecting the world to be kind. Jonas watched it until the light went out. Then he leaned back in his chair, boots crossed, rifle beside him, and let the silence settle. He had come looking for solitude, and he had found it. But even as the night deepened, he could not shake the feeling that Dry Creek was watching him, waiting, like a held breath, for something neither he nor the widow at the store could yet name. Emotional tone and realization, tone of loneliness and restrained grace. Both Jonas and Mara sensed the quiet weight of shared ghosts and unspoken debts. Realization. Every arrival costs something, and every return digs up what was buried. The days fell into a quiet rhythm, measured by hammer strikes and the creak of old timber. Jonas Hale rose before dawn, when frost still bit the edges of the world, and worked until the sun sank red behind the ridges. The ranch was slow to forgive him. Boards warped from years of neglect, hinges refused to turn, and nails bent as though the land itself resisted being mended. He spoke little, save to the horse or to himself. Yet in that silence, the ghosts began to stir. Voices in the wind, half-remembered laughter from the days when this ranch still knew the sound of women singing. Every plank he replaced felt like a small conversation with the past. I know you were here. I know what you lost. On the third morning, a wagon approached along the frozen road. Jonas straightened, hand on the brim of his hat, as Mara McCary stepped down with a small burlap sack in her arms. Bread, she said simply. And coffee grounds. There's no use letting them go stale, he nodded. I can pay. Her mouth twitched, a half-smile, half-rebuke. Wasn't asking for coin. Trade'll do. You've got eggs or milk soon enough? He took the sack and gestured toward the porch. Coffee's boiling. You're welcome to a cup. She hesitated, glancing toward the barn as if weighing the worth of his words. Then she nodded once and followed him inside. The room was plain but clean. The smell of sawdust and smoke filled the air. Jonas poured the coffee into 2 tin cups, its surface shimmering like oil in the light. Didn't think you'd come all the way out here, he said. Someone has to see what you're doing with my father's land, she answered, taking a sip. Her tone was light, but her eyes lingered on the walls, the patched roof, the empty hearth. Jonas studied her over the rim of his cup. She wasn't beautiful in the way folks told stories about, no soft curls, no painted lips, but there was something about her calm that drew the world inward. She wore her plainness like armor. I'll have the place right before spring, he said. Might keep a few cattle. Spring doesn't come easy here, she murmured. Winter never quite leaves these hills. You'll learn that soon enough. Their eyes met, brief, steady, and something unspoken passed between them. The acknowledgement of 2 souls who had weathered too many storms alone. When she left, she thanked him for the coffee but not for the company. Jonas watched her wagon fade into the cold horizon, the sound of its wheels echoing long after she was gone. By the next week, Dry Creek had found a new subject to chew on, the widow McCary visiting the ex-scout's ranch. At the blacksmith shop, men joked that Mara had finally found someone too stubborn to turn her away. At the saloon, laughter carried through the smoke, sharp as spurs. They spoke of Lila, the golden sister, the one who could break hearts by looking at a man too long, and of Mara, who could hardly make one look twice. They remembered how Lila's husband died under a red sky in Apache country, how Jonas Hale had been there when it happened. Some said it wasn't accident or honor, but guilt that brought him back. Others said he was just too tired to ride farther west. Jonas heard most of it from his seat at the end of the bar. He didn't look up, didn't answer, didn't even frown. The whiskey in his hand was cheap, but it burned just enough to remind him he was still alive. Then one of the ranch hands, young, loud, eager for laughter, leaned back in his chair and said, "That McCary woman ought to thank her lucky stars someone's desperate enough to visit. Ain't no man touched her since her sister went to dirt." The room broke into uneasy chuckles. Jonas set his glass down. The sound was quiet, but it cut through the noise like a knife. He turned his head slowly, eyes finding the speaker. No anger, no threat, just a long, steady look that made the laughter die on the man's lips. "Best you drink your whiskey," Jonas said softly. The boy swallowed hard, color draining from his face. The others looked away. The piano in the corner stopped mid-song. For a long moment the saloon held its breath. Then Jonas stood, laid a coin on the counter, and walked out into the cold. Outside, snow began to fall, fine as ash. That evening, the sky burned red as a dying fire. Jonas rode out toward the cemetery on the edge of town, drawn by something he couldn't name. The gate creaked as he pushed it open. Between the leaning stones, he found Mara kneeling in the snow before a weathered marker. Lila McCary, 1847, 1871. Mara's hands brushed frost from the name. She didn't turn when she heard him approach. "The ground's too hard to dig," she said quietly. "So I bring flowers when I can. They don't last long, but it makes me feel less alone, I suppose." Jonas stepped closer, the snow crunching beneath his boots. "She was loved," Mara nodded. "Too much, maybe, and by too many. It's strange. When a person dies, the world remembers them prettier than they were." He looked at the grave. Memory always polishes what the living wore down. She finally turned her face toward him, the wind tugging loose strands of her hair. The setting sun painted her eyes copper red. "I heard what happened at the saloon," she said. He shrugged. "Wasn't worth words. You didn't have to stand up for me." "I didn't," he said simply. "Just didn't see the use in cruelty." For a long moment, they stood in silence, the wind moving through the dead grass like a slow breath. Then she gathered her shawl tighter and walked past him, heading toward her wagon. Jonas watched her go until the horizon swallowed her shape. When he returned home later, the porch was dark. But as he climbed the steps, he saw something lying beside the door, a half loaf of bread, wrapped in cloth still warm from the hearth. He stood there for a moment, staring at it, the gesture so small it felt like a prayer. Then he carried it inside, broke off a piece, and ate it slowly by the fire. The bread was simple, rough, slightly bitter at the crust, but it tasted like something forgotten. Grace without apology. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of wood smoke from the valley below. The past clung to the hills like fog, but for the first time since his arrival, Jonas felt it loosening its hold, just enough to breathe. Emotional tone and realization, tone of muted sorrow and dignity. The past clings like smoke, but both Jonas and Mara begin to find solace in unspoken kindness. Realization. You cannot rebuild a home without first burying the ghosts inside it. The sky that morning was the color of lead, the air thick and restless, as if the land itself were holding its breath. Jonas Hale stood at the fence line, watching the clouds roll in from the mountains, a dark wall swallowing the ridges one by one. The horses felt it too. They shifted uneasily, ears flicking toward the horizon where thunder murmured low and far. He tightened the last length of wire and wiped his hands on his coat. There would be rain by noon, hard and mean. He started toward the barn to bring the tools in when something caught his eye near the river bend below, a flicker of movement against the dull grass. At first he thought it a stray calf. Then he saw the dark figure tumble from a horse and lie still. Jonas's heart kicked hard. He swung into his saddle and rode down the hill at a gallop, hooves slicing through the wind. By the time he reached the riverbank, the rain had begun, a cold, needling downpour that blurred the world into gray. The figure was a boy, maybe 16, skin bronze beneath mud and blood. His hair was long and matted, his shirt torn, one arm wrapped in a crude bandage stained through. The horse beside him, a paint mare, snorted weakly and staggered away into the trees. Jonas dismounted and knelt beside the boy. The pulse was there, faint but steady. "Easy," he murmured, though the boy was far beyond hearing. "You're all right now." He lifted him carefully, feeling the weight of fever in the boy's body. The wound in his side was deep, maybe from a bullet or a blade. It was hard to tell in the rain. Jonas slung him over the saddle and turned his horse back toward the ranch, water streaming from his hat brim, thunder cracking overhead like the sky coming apart. By the time he reached the yard, Mara McCary was there, shawl pulled over her head, hair plastered to her face. She had seen him riding through the storm and followed on foot, her lantern swinging in the dark. "Who is it?" she called, voice nearly drowned by the wind. "Don't know!" Jonas shouted back. "Found him by the river." When she saw the boy's face, she drew in a sharp breath. "He's Apache," Jonas met her eyes. "Maybe, doesn't matter." Her jaw tightened, but she nodded. "Get him inside." They carried the boy into the barn and laid him on a bed of blankets near the stove. Mara's hands were steady as she fetched water and tore strips from her own skirt for bandages. Jonas cleaned the wound, his fingers slick with blood. The smell of iron filled the air, mingling with the damp scent of hay and smoke. "He's burning up," Mara said. "If the fever breaks, he might live." Jonas poured whiskey over the wound, and the boy stirred, just enough to let out a weak sound that was half pain, half fear. Mara brushed his hair back gently, murmuring words too soft for Jonas to catch. Outside, the storm raged. Rain beat against the roof in a steady roar. Lightning lit the barn in white flashes, and in each one, Jonas saw her face, eyes focused, calm amid the chaos. Hours passed that way. Him holding the boy still, her washing the blood away. Their hands met once by accident in the lamplight. For a heartbeat, everything stilled, the storm, the world, the years between them. When they finally stepped back, the boy slept. His breathing shallow but even, Mara tied her shawl tighter and looked toward the door. "They won't like this," Jonas said nothing. He poured coffee into a tin cup and stared out at the rain. By morning, the news had spread. Sheriff Cale rode out before noon, his horse sweating, his hat dripping water. He was a broad man with gray whiskers and eyes that had seen too much of both peace and war. "Jonas," he said as he dismounted, "I hear you've taken in one of the Apache boys." Jonas stood on the porch, rifle leaning against the wall beside him. "He was half dead when I found him." "I don't doubt it. But you know how it looks. Folks are uneasy. There've been raids north of here." "This boy wasn't raiding," Jonas said. "He was running," the sheriff sighed. "Maybe so. But Dry Creek's holding on by a thread. You start choosing sides, that thread'll snap." Behind Jonas, the door creaked open. Mara stepped out, shawl drawn tight against the wind. "He's a child, Cale," she said quietly. "You going to hang a child to make the town sleep easier?" Cale's gaze softened. "Mara, you know I'd never—" "Then let him heal," she interrupted. Her voice trembled, but her eyes did not. The sheriff looked from her to Jonas, then shook his head. "You're both too stubborn for your own good. I'll tell the men to hold off. But if trouble comes of this, I can't promise to stand in the way." He turned and rode off into the gray. That night, the storm returned with a vengeance. Wind tore across the plains, rain hammering the roof like fists. Jonas and Mara tended the fire in the barn, keeping the boy warm. His fever broke near midnight, sweat glistening on his brow. When he finally opened his eyes, They were dark and alert, filled with the guarded fear of someone who had learned not to trust the world. Jonas knelt beside him. "You're safe here, son. No one's going to hurt you." The boy whispered something, his name perhaps, but the words dissolved in exhaustion. Mara dipped a cloth in cool water and pressed it to his forehead. Her hands trembled now that the danger had passed. Jonas caught her wrist gently. "You did good," he said. She shook her head. "We just gave him a chance. The rest is up to God." They sat together in silence after that, the storm slowly easing, the fire burning low. The boy slept between them, breathing steady. Outside, the rain softened to mist. The air smelled of wet earth and smoke. Jonas leaned back against the stall post, watching Mara in the fading light. Her shawl had slipped from her shoulders, and her hair, damp and unpinned, fell loose around her face. There was no softness in her beauty, only strength, carved from the same stubborn clay as the land itself. When she finally looked up, their eyes met across the quiet space between them. Neither spoke. Neither needed to. By dawn, the storm was gone. Mist curled through the valley, silver and thin. Jonas and Mara sat on the porch with coffee steaming between their hands. The boy slept inside alive. The silence between them had changed, no longer empty but full of something unspoken and solid as the hills. Jonas looked toward the horizon, where the first light touched the wet grass. "Reckon the town'll have its say," he murmured. "They always do," Mara said. "But we'll have ours too." He turned to her then, saw the steadiness in her eyes, the fire beneath all that quiet. And for the first time, he didn't see a woman left behind. He saw someone who could stand against the whole world beside him. Emotional tone and realization, tone of defiance and awakening. They discover shared courage, a bond born not from comfort, but from danger and conviction. Realization. Sometimes love begins where the rest of the world draws its line. The storm left the land clean and hollow. For 3 days, the clouds thinned into pale streaks over the hills, and the wind carried the scent of wet earth and pine. Jonas woke each morning to the same sound, the soft scrape of Mara's boots on the porch, and the steady breath of the boy sleeping in the next room. They called him Toma, though he had not spoken enough words for Jonas to be sure it was his true name. The fever had broken, but his strength returned like a shy creature, slow, cautious, uncertain if it was welcome to stay. Jonas spent his days outside, fixing what the storm had broken. Fence posts leaned at odd angles. The barn roof dripped like a sieve. He worked with a quiet steadiness, each nail a kind of prayer for the life he'd once let fall to ruin. Every evening, when the hammer fell silent, lamplight would bloom in the cabin window, a small, golden square in the dark. Mara cooked there, her movements careful and deliberate, as though the wrong motion might shatter the fragile peace between them. She didn't say much. Neither did he. Yet the silence felt full, like two people speaking in a language older than words. Inside the cabin, the air was thick with the smells of broth, smoke, and the faint sharpness of lye soap. Toma slept by the hearth, curled under the old wool blanket Jonas had brought down from the loft. The boy's mare grazed in the corral, her sides thin but mending. "His arm's healing clean," Mara said one night, spooning broth into a tin bowl. "The scar won't be bad." Jonas nodded from his chair near the door. "He'll ride again before winter's out." She glanced at him, just long enough to meet his eyes, then back to the bowl. "You sound sure." "I've seen worse come back," he said. The quiet that followed was neither comfortable nor cold. It simply existed, like the ticking of the clock on the shelf or the wind slipping through the chimney stones. When she set the bowl down beside Toma, Jonas caught the small tremor in her hands. He didn't mention it. Some things deserved their privacy. The town, meanwhile, had grown meaner in its silence. When Jonas rode in for supplies, conversation stopped mid-sentence. The clerk at the mercantile spoke to him through tight lips, counting his change too quickly. Outside, 2 cowhands muttered near the hitching rail. He caught words like widow, savage, and fool. He didn't answer them, just fixed his hat and rode out. but the words stuck like burrs. By the time he reached the ranch, snow had begun to fall, small white flakes that melted on his coat. The world felt cleaner under the quiet weight of it. He led the horse into the barn and stayed there a while, letting the smell of hay and dust settle his thoughts. Through the open door, he saw the cabin light flicker, and for a brief, foolish moment, he thought it looked like home. That night, he found Mara sitting by the table mending one of Toma's shirts. The fabric was thin and torn, the color faded from travel and weather. She worked slowly, her needle flashing in and out of the cloth. Jonas stood in the doorway, hat in hand. "You should rest," he said softly. "I can't sleep," she replied, not looking up. Hands need something to do when the mind won't quiet. He hesitated. "You've done plenty already." She smiled faintly, though her eyes stayed fixed on the shirt. "You don't know what plenty is for a woman who's buried more than she's built." He stepped closer. "Mara," the needle paused mid-air. Her voice broke before she could finish. "I had a child once. A long time ago. He didn't live to see the spring." Jonas stood still. The fire popped softly in the stove. "I used to think," she went on, her words low and even, "that maybe God was saving me for something. That all the emptiness meant there'd be a reason someday. But sometimes, I think maybe he just forgot." Jonas didn't try to speak. Words felt useless, like trying to patch a wound with smoke. He only nodded, slow and heavy, letting the silence be what comfort he could offer. After a long while, he said quietly, "You did right by the boy." "That counts for something." She gave a small, brittle laugh. "It's not about counting, Jonas. It's about feeling something alive again, even if it hurts." He didn't argue. When she set the mended shirt aside and rose to leave, he saw her fingers trembling, not from the cold, but from the weight of everything she had kept locked away. Later that night, when the house had gone still, Jonas sat alone at the table with a carving knife and a block of pine. His hands moved without thought, shaving, smoothing, shaping. By the time dawn pressed gray light through the window, a small wooden horse stood on the table. Its head bowed as if listening for something lost. He left it there and went out to the barn. When Mara woke, the fire had gone low. She poured water into the pot, stoking the coals, and turned toward the table. The carving caught her eye. She picked it up, thumb tracing the smooth curve of its mane. It was rough in places, but alive with care, the kind of thing a man makes not to impress, but to say what he cannot bring himself to speak aloud. Her breath hitched. The world blurred for a moment, the edges of everything going soft. She sank into the chair and let the tears fall, quiet as the snow outside. Not for the past. Not for the child she'd buried, or the years that had emptied her, but for the strange, tender ache of feeling something begin again. By evening, the snow deepened. The ranch looked almost whole again. White roofs, dark fences, smoke rising thin from the chimney. Toma fed the horses under the watchful eyes of dusk. Jonas came in with frost on his coat and a kind of peace in his step. He didn't mention the carving, and she didn't thank him for it. Some things were better left as they were, delicate, unspoken, alive. Inside the small cabin, they moved around each other like two shadows learning how to share the same light. Mara poured coffee. Jonas fixed the hinge on the window that always rattled in the wind. Outside, snow fell in soft, steady silence, and inside, without either daring to name it, something warm and fragile took root, like spring sleeping under winter's skin. Emotional tone and realization, tone of quiet yearning and fragile peace. They learn that healing isn't loud. It's the sound of two lives slowly remembering warmth. Realization, love grows strongest in silence, when words are too fragile to trust. The night came still and heavy, with a low wind whispering through the cottonwoods. The air smelled of frost and something waiting to break. Jonas sat by the dying hearth, wrapping a clean bandage around Toma's arm. When the first sound reached them, distant hooves, stumbling and uneven, like riders who'd been too long at the bottle, Mara looked up from the stove, ladle frozen mid-air. "You expecting anyone?" Jonas shook his head. "Not tonight." Outside, the horses neighed, restless. Then came laughter, sharp, mean, and familiar. the kind that carried no joy in it, only the thrill of destruction. Jonas rose, took his rifle from above the door. "Stay here," but Mara was already moving toward Toma. "You'll need help," she whispered, her voice more resolve than fear. The hooves stopped near the barn. Then came the crack of a lantern smashing, the whoosh of flame catching hay. A roar followed, hungry and alive. Jonas stepped into the cold, the smell of smoke rushing up to meet him. Fire licked the barn walls, orange light blooming against the dark like the mouth of hell opening. Shadows moved behind it, men on horseback, their shapes distorted in the flickering blaze. One of them shouted, "Dry Creek don't need traitors, Hale!" "You side with savages, you burn with them." The words hit harder than the wind. Jonas lifted his rifle. "Go home," he called back, "before I send you there myself." The fire crackled, devouring the dry timber. Sparks drifted skyward, glowing like brief, desperate stars. Mara burst from the cabin, dragging Toma by the hand. "Get behind the trough!" Jonas shouted. She pulled the boy through the mud, skirts heavy, hair plastered to her face. Behind her, the barn door gave way, flames spilling out in a rush that lit the yard bright as noon. Gunfire shattered the night. A bullet struck the fence post near Jonas's head, splintering it. He fired back, the recoil jolting through his shoulder. Another shot came. A searing flash of pain tore through his upper arm. He stumbled, but didn't fall. The rifle's next round found its mark. One of the riders dropped his torch and cursed before wheeling his horse away. The others hesitated. The fire roared higher, a living wall between them and the ranch. Jonas fired again, once, twice, until the shapes turned to smoke and retreating hoofbeats. Then there was only the sound of burning and the hard, ragged pull of his breath. Mara ran to him, mud streaking her shawl. "Jonas!" He half-turned, swaying, pressing a hand to his wound. Blood seeped through his sleeve, dark and quick. "Let it be," he muttered, teeth clenched. "Save the horses! The horses are gone," she said sharply. "You're not." She took hold of him before he could protest, half guiding, half dragging him toward the cabin. The rain began again, thin at first, then steady, hissing as it struck the flames. The smell of wet ash filled the air. Behind them, the barn moaned, timbers collapsing inward with a roar that shook the earth. Sparks flew skyward like souls escaping judgment. Jonas looked back once, his jaw tightening. All that work. "It's just wood," Mara said. "You're what's left standing." Inside, she pushed him into the chair by the stove. The room filled with the sharp scent of blood and smoke. She tore a strip from her shawl and pressed it to the wound. He flinched, breath hissing through his teeth. "You'll need stitching," she said, her voice shaking now that the danger had passed. "Had worse," he said. "Not lately." Their eyes met. In hers burned something fierce and fragile, a fire of her own making. She wrapped the shawl tighter around his arm, not caring that the cloth soaked red. Outside, the rain came harder, a cleansing storm washing the ash into the soil. The boy sat silent in the corner, staring at the window where the barn had once stood. Jonas's strength faltered, but he stayed awake, watching Mara work. Every movement was careful, reverent, as if tending not just to his wound but to something greater, the thin, trembling thread that tied them both to life. "You shouldn't have followed me out there," he murmured. "And you shouldn't have stood alone," she replied, not looking up. "Seems we're both guilty," he almost smiled. "You did good. So did you," she said softly. "You didn't let them take what was ours. Hours passed." The fire burned low, the rain steady on the roof. Jonas drifted between pain and quiet, the world narrowing to the sound of Mara's voice, low, steady, somewhere between a prayer and a promise. When dawn came, the storm broke apart into soft gray mist. Smoke still rose from what had been the barn, curling into the pale sky like the last breath of something too proud to die quietly. Jonas stood outside, arm bound, shirt stiff with dried blood. The sheriff had come and gone, leaving behind a warning and a weary nod. "Best you lay low," he'd said. "Folks'll come around, or they won't. But you did what was right. Now only the three of them remained. The man, the woman, and the boy, watching the ruins steam in the cold morning light. Mara's shawl was still stained. Her face pale but steady, she stood beside Jonas, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. "It'll take time to rebuild," she said quietly. Jonas nodded. "Rebuilding's all I seem to know." She looked at him then, really looked, past the scars, past the years of silence and dust. "You're bleeding again," she said. He glanced down at his sleeve. "It'll stop," her gaze softened. "Some wounds don't." He didn't answer, just watched the last of the smoke drift upward, vanishing into the clean light of morning. When she reached for his hand, he didn't pull away. Their fingers brushed, rough skin meeting calloused warmth. Neither spoke. The fire had taken what was false, the distance, the hesitation, the ghosts, and left behind only what was true. Two souls standing together, alive despite everything meant to break them. Mara closed her eyes, feeling the warmth of his hand, the rain still dripping from the eaves, the faint crackle of embers cooling in the yard. In that moment, she understood. Not all fires destroy. Some burn only to reveal what should have been seen all along. Emotional tone and realization, tone of violence and revelation. Destruction becomes purification. What was tested now stands proven. Realization. Fire takes what's false and leaves only truth behind. Winter loosened its grip slowly, like a hand unclenching after a long, hard hold. The snow melted into ruts along the road, and the valley filled with the smell of thawing earth and pine sap. The days stretched longer, lighter. The worst had passed. The barn was gone, nothing left but charred beams and the black ribs of what once sheltered their work. Yet every morning Jonas and Mara rose to rebuild. He lifted the new frame with his good arm. She steadied the planks, her shawl tied tight against the wind. The sound of hammering carried across the valley, steady, certain, alive. No one from Dry Creek came to help. But sometimes, from the ridge above, faces appeared, men who once laughed at the saloon or turned their backs in the store. They watched in silence, guilt written in their posture. None dared ride closer. Then one morning, a wagon creaked down the road. Sheriff Lyle climbed out, his hat in hand. He said nothing at first, only studied the blackened earth and the woman kneeling beside it, planting a new line of fence posts. "They'll not own what they did," he said finally. "But word spreads fast, men talk." "They know you stood your ground," Jonas nodded, driving a nail into place. "Knowing's one thing, owning's another." The sheriff sighed, looking out toward the river. "You'll find no justice worth chasing here, Jonas. Best kind's the kind a man builds with his own hands." Jonas met his gaze. "That's all I've been trying to do." When the sheriff left, the valley grew quiet again, only the tapping of the hammer, the creak of boards, and the call of meadowlarks echoing through the warming air. By mid-March, the new barn stood where the old one had burned. The wood was rough, unfinished, but strong. It didn't look like the past. It looked like something trying to live again. That evening, Mara stood in the doorway, wiping sawdust from her hands. "You should rest that arm," she said. Jonas glanced down at the scar that cut across his forearm, a jagged mark shaped like a flame. "It's healing fine," she smiled faintly. "Still looks like fire." He flexed his hand, the skin pulling tight. "Maybe it's meant to." She didn't ask what he meant. Some truths didn't need translation. The next day Toma came to say goodbye. His horse was stronger now, his face fuller, the color returned to his cheeks. He wore a new coat Mara had mended for him and carried a small satchel filled with coffee, jerky, and a piece of bread wrapped in cloth. "I go home," he said in careful English, his dark eyes serious. "North Valley." "My people wait," Jonas gripped his shoulder. "You'll tell them we did what we could?" The boy nodded. "You will be remembered as friends." Mara's hands trembled as she tied the last knot on his satchel. "Be safe," she whispered. Thomas smiled. "You too." He rode away into the open hills, his figure shrinking until it was just a shadow moving through light. When he vanished over the ridge, Jonas and Mara stood for a long while, listening to the wind hum through the new boards of the barn. Days passed. The valley turned green again. Shoots of grass pushed through the ash. Life, uninvited and unashamed, returned. Each morning, They shared coffee on the porch, watching sunlight crawl across the fence line. Her shawl still smelled faintly of smoke. His arm still ached when the wind turned cold. But the silence between them had changed. It no longer felt like something missing. It was full, steady, companionable. Jonas had never known this kind of peace. Not the loud peace of parades or praise, but the quiet kind. The one that came after fire, when the land stopped screaming and began to breathe again. One evening, as dusk fell soft across the prairie, Jonas walked to the oak tree that had survived the blaze. Its bark was blackened, but green shoots were breaking through the wounds. He stood there a long time, turning something small over in his hand. Mara came up behind him, shawl drawn close. "You've been out here near an hour," she said. He nodded. "Just thinking." She stepped beside him and saw what he held. A simple gold ring, dulled with age, its engraving worn smooth. "Lila's?" she asked softly. He nodded again. "Found it in my saddlebag. Been carrying it too long." She said nothing, only waited. "I thought I owed her something," he said finally, voice rough with dust and memory. "But maybe the dead don't want what belongs to the living." He knelt, dug a small hole at the base of the oak, and placed the ring inside. The soil was damp, cold, forgiving. When he covered it, the earth took it without ceremony, like a secret it had been waiting to keep. "Some things," he said quietly, "don't belong to the dead anymore." Mara reached out, her hand finding his. For a long while neither spoke. The horizon glowed faintly, the last light of day spilling gold across the new boards of the barn. The next morning, they saddled the horses. The road to town stretched long and familiar, lined with sagebrush and spring grass. Jonas tightened the reins with his good hand. "Haven't been to town since the fire." Mara adjusted her shawl. "Then it's time." They rode side by side, the hooves thudding softly in the thawed earth. When they reached the outskirts of Dry Creek, people looked up from their porches, pausing mid-task. No one spoke, but the usual coldness in their eyes was gone, replaced by something quieter. Respect, maybe, or shame. At the mercantile, Jonas hitched the horses while Mara stepped inside. The same clerk who once refused to meet her eyes greeted her now with a nod and a careful smile. He weighed the coffee beans slow, as though giving her the dignity long denied. When she stepped back outside, Jonas was waiting with a sack of nails and 2 tin mugs. "Figured we'd earned a fresh set," he said. She smiled. "For the next rebuild." He looked at her then, the curve of her jaw in the sunlight, the strength in her eyes, the softness that survived it all. "For whatever comes." They rode home under a sky turning rose and silver, the land alive again beneath their horses. The oak stood waiting at the ridge, its branches trembling in the wind like a quiet benediction. When they reached the porch, Jonas poured the first mug of coffee, handed it to her, and sat beside her in the creaking chair. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The silence between them was no longer a wound. It was a home. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, and the wind carried the smell of rain over the hills. Mara closed her eyes and leaned into the stillness, into the warmth beside her. Jonas glanced toward the barn, their barn, and felt something shift deep inside him, gentle and certain. Love, he realized, wasn't found in the wildness of youth or the noise of courtship. It was built plank by plank, silence by silence, from the ashes of who they once were. Emotional tone and realization, tone of acceptance and quiet redemption. The story ends where it began, in silence, but now that silence is full of belonging. Realization, love isn't found. It's rebuilt from the ashes of who we once were.